The first thing to go was his breath. It caught in his throat like a shard of glass stolen by a voice from the shadows below. Then his heart, a frantic bird trapped against his ribs. 13-year-old Finn O'Connell pressed himself into the hay of the loft, praying the sweet, dusty scent of dried clover could swallow him whole. Down below, in the dark hollow of the Redemption Gulch livery, Death was having a conversation. Two men had taken shelter from the coming storm, their boots scraping the packed earth. Their voices were low, gravelly, and soaked in whiskey. Finn recognized them as Jed and Pike, drifters who orbited the powerful cattle baron Silas Croft like hungry coyotes. "Croft wants it clean," Jed's voice rasped. "A robbery on the trail." "Cutters pass," Pike added, his voice like stones grinding together. "Narrow, nowhere to run." Finn didn't dare move. Every muscle was a wire pulled taut. He was a creature of the stables, used to being overlooked. But this was different. This was the terror of a rabbit hiding from circling hawks. "The widow drives that herd to the fort Friday," Jed continued. "Sunrise. She won't have more than 2 hands with her. Easy work. Asterisk the widow." The words landed like a physical blow. A brilliant flash of lightning lit the stable, etching the hard, pitiless faces of the men into Finn's memory for a split second. Then, a deafening crack of thunder shook the very foundations of the building. It sounded like the world breaking apart. It was, because in the unforgiving dust of Redemption Gulch, the widow, Elara Hayes, was the only person who knew Finn O'Connell was alive. To everyone else, he was a phantom, a smudge of dirt and sweat who moved through the world unseen. His existence was measured in the heft of a feed bucket, the rhythmic rasp of a curry comb on a horse's flank, the sting of lye soap on his chapped hands. The townsfolk looked through him as if he were made of glass, but not Elara Hayes. The owner of the Triple Creek Ranch was a woman carved from the same unyielding landscape as the mesas, her face a map of sun and sorrow since her husband's passing. But her eyes held a kindness that was like water in the desert. When she came to town, her gaze would find him in the shadows. "Finn," she would say, and the sound of his own name was a strange and precious thing. It grounded him, gave him shape. She'd hand him the reins to her prized mare, Starlight, her fingers brushing his, a fleeting touch that felt more real than a whole day's labor. She brought him an apple once, crisp and red. Another time, a shirt he'd torn on a nail returned with the seam stitched with a neatness that spoke of care. Months ago, she'd pressed a worn book into his hands. "Treasure Island. A boy needs adventures," she'd said, her voice soft. Even if only on the page. He kept it wrapped in a spare rag in the tiny crawl space behind the tack room where he slept, its presence a secret warmth against the perpetual chill of his loneliness. To him, Elara Hayes was not just a kind woman. She was proof that he was real. And now, these men in the dark were planning to extinguish her. Long after their footsteps faded into the storm, Finn remained frozen in the hayloft. The rain came then, a torrential downpour that hammered the roof, each drop a nail in the coffin of his stolen peace. He felt impossibly small, a boy trapped in a story far too large for him. Slowly, stiffly, he climbed down the ladder, his limbs trembling. He stumbled to his crawl space behind the tack room and fumbled for the cloth-wrapped book. His fingers traced the faded gold letters of the title. Treasure Island. The adventure was no longer on the page. It was here, and it was terrifying. At dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean, the air sharp and cool. But for Finn, the landscape was tainted. Every shadow held a threat. Every sound was a footstep behind him. He knew what he had to do. The law was the law. It was for things like this. He found Sheriff Brody in his office, a mug of coffee steaming in his hand, his boots propped on his desk. The morning sun glinted off the polished star on his chest. It took Finn 3 attempts to make a sound. "Sheriff?" His voice was a reedy whisper. Brody lowered his coffee, his eyes flat and impatient. "What is it, boy?" Finn's story tumbled out, a frantic, disjointed mess of names and places. Croft. Jed and Pike. Cutter's Pass. He spoke of the storm, the voices in the dark, the murder of Elara Hayes. He watched the sheriff's face, praying for a flicker of concern, of duty. He saw nothing but bored annoyance. Brody set his mug down with a decisive clink. "That's quite a tale." He leaned back, his chair creaking in protest. "Silas Croft is a respectable man, a pillar of this community, and you're the stable boy." He said the words as if they were an indictment. "You think anyone's going to believe a stable boy's fancies over the word of Mr. Croft?" "But I heard them," Finn insisted, his voice cracking. "It's the truth." "The truth is what powerful men say it is, boy," Brody said, his tone laced with a weary cynicism. He picked up a cloth and began to polish his already gleaming star. "You go spreading rumors like that, you'll find yourself in a world of trouble. Now get out of here." "I'm busy." Finn stood there for a moment, the sheriff's dismissal hanging in the air like smoke. The polished star seemed to mock him, a bright, empty circle of authority. He turned and walked out, the heavy door swinging shut behind him, closing off his last hope. The weight he had carried to the sheriff's office had not been lifted. It had doubled. He was alone. Later that day, the fear took on a face. As he was sweeping the walkway in front of the livery, Jed and Pike emerged from the saloon. Their eyes found him instantly. Pike, a man with a face like a knotted root, stared at him, his expression utterly blank, void of any human warmth. Jed, taller and leaner, paused. He worked a wad of tobacco in his jaw, then spat a stream of brown juice that landed inches from Finn's bare feet. It was not a random act. It was a message. A signature on a death warrant. "Concher, we see you." His invisibility, his only shield, was gone. To be seen by such men was to be marked. He scurried back into the familiar gloom of the stable, but his sanctuary now felt like a trap. The scent of hay and leather no longer brought comfort, only the suffocating feeling of a closing fist. He leaned his forehead against the warm flank of a chestnut mare, drawing a shuddering breath. From the stable door, he could see the faint, distant line of the mesas that marked the edge of the Triple Creek Ranch. He pictured Elara Hayes, her quiet smile, the way she spoke his name. He couldn't let it be extinguished. His gaze fell on Starlight, dozing in her clean stall. The mare was faster than any horse in the county, a creature of wind and spirit. Finn was not a gunslinger. He was not a hero from a book. He was a stable boy. But he knew horses. And he knew the land, the hidden arroyos, the game trails, the treacherous shortcuts that no one else bothered with. An idea, born not of courage, but of sheer desperation, began to form in his mind. It was a wild, impossible gamble. It was all he had. The world was still drowned in the deep indigo of pre-dawn when Finn moved. He didn't think. He just did. Every action was precise, driven by a terrible clarity. He slipped from his crawl space, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. In Starlight's stall, he laid a hand on the mare's powerful neck, whispering to her, his breath mingling with hers in the cool air. She nickered softly, as if she understood. He didn't dare use a lantern. He bridled her by touch alone, his fingers sure and familiar. Leading her from the stable, he swung himself onto her bare back. There was no time for a saddle. He urged her not toward the main road, but toward the open plains, a dark, ghostly expanse under a canopy of fading stars. And then they were flying. The ride was a frantic prayer. Starlight's hooves devoured the ground, a relentless, thundering rhythm that was the new beat of Finn's own heart. He clung to her mane, the wind tearing at his thin shirt, whipping tears from his eyes. He didn't follow the wagon trail but cut across the broken land, navigating by instinct, by the silhouette of a familiar butte against the lightening sky. This was his land, the lonely kingdom he had explored on foot, and he used its secrets now as a weapon. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the clouds in violent shades of orange and rose. Time was running out. He pushed Starlight harder, whispering pleas into her flattened ear. He could feel the mare's great heart pounding, her muscles straining. She was giving him everything. He crested a low rise and saw them. Below, a small herd of cattle moved slowly, herded by 3 riders. Elara Hayes was at the lead, sitting tall in her saddle. To the east, a dark gash in the landscape marked the entrance to Cutter's Pass. At the same moment, high in the rocks above the pass, a glint of sunlight flashed off a rifle barrel. Jed settled in, his eye to the sight. Below him, Pike took his position, a predator tasting the air, patient and certain. Finn kicked his heels into Starlight's lathered sides, and the mare gave one last, desperate surge of speed. He burst from a dry wash, a wild apparition of dust and motion, and angled directly in front of Elara's path. "Mrs. Hayes!" he screamed, his voice raw. He slid from Starlight's back, stumbling, pointing frantically at the pass. "It's a trap! An ambush! In the rocks!" Her 2 ranch hands reached for their sidearms, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. But Elara's eyes were locked on Finn. She saw the genuine terror etched on his face, the exhaustion of his near-spent horse. She saw the truth. There was no hesitation. Her face hardened, the quiet kindness replaced by a steely resolve. She trusted the boy who cared for her horse. "The herd!" she shouted to her men, her voice cracking like a whip. "Turn them! Into the pass! Now!" Her hands, startled but obedient, understood. They wheeled their horses, yelling, firing their pistols not at the unseen enemy, but into the air behind the cattle. The sharp reports, alien and terrifying, electrified the herd. A low rumble turned into a roar as the steers, panicked and blind, surged forward. They became a living avalanche of horn and hide, a thundering river of dust and fury that poured directly into the narrow confines of Cutter's Pass. High above, Jed and Pike could only watch in disbelief as their perfect ambush was swallowed by a stampede. The ground shook, boulders dislodged from the canyon walls. Their plan, their very lives were swept away in the chaos. They scrambled from their perches, their rifles abandoned, fleeing the tide of bellowing longhorns that threatened to pulverize them. The thunder of hooves faded into the distance. A thick cloud of dust hung in the morning air, slowly settling back to the earth. It was over. The silence that returned was different, no longer heavy with secrets, but clean and vast. Elara rode to where Finn stood beside the trembling Starlight. He looked up at her, his small frame shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. She dismounted and, without a word, reached out and placed a firm, steadying hand on his shoulder. Her touch was an anchor. It said more than words ever could. It said, "You are safe. You are seen. You are brave." They rode back to Redemption Gulch not as a widow and a stable boy, but as allies forged in a crucible of fear. Elara Hayes did not go to the sheriff's office. She stood in the middle of the main street, Finn at her side, her 2 ranch hands behind her. Her voice, clear and strong, cut through the morning quiet. She told the story of the ambush, of the men in the rocks, and she spoke Silas Croft's name, the accusation ringing with the undeniable weight of truth. Sheriff Brody, faced with a respected landowner, multiple witnesses, and a story that could no longer be dismissed as a boy's fancy, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. For the first time in a long time, the polished star on his chest felt heavy. A week later, the sun set over the Triple Creek Ranch. The sky was a soft canvas of bruised purples and pale gold. Finn sat on the edge of the porch, mending a bridle, his fingers, once clumsy with fear, now moving with a quiet confidence. He wore clean clothes. He slept in a real bed in a small room that smelled of cedar and clean linen, not of manure and dust. Elara came out and sat in the rocking chair beside him, the gentle creak a comforting rhythm in the twilight. They didn't speak for a long time, simply watching the last light fade from the sky. The world was vast and beautiful from this porch. "My husband, he believed this land remembers," she said softly, her voice blending with the evening sounds. Remembers the droughts, the storms. Remembers the good people too. Finn stopped his work, looking out at the darkening plains. He thought of the livery, of the shadows and the silence. He was no longer invisible. He had a name, spoken with kindness. He had a home. A boy needs adventures, she added, a faint smile touching her lips as she looked at him. Finn met her gaze. He had found his adventure, not on the pages of a book, but in the heart of a horse, and the courage he never knew he had. In saving the only person who had ever been kind to him, he had, in the end, saved himself. The silence now was one of peace. If you enjoyed this incredible tale from the frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American West. Click on the video on the screen for another tale we think you will love.